2,000 years ago, one civilization held the entire Western world in its grasp. From Northern Europe to Africa and the Middle East, it imposed laws, ideas, and a single language. For 2 millennia, we've dreamed of its cities and its triumphs, its idealism. Most of what we know about the birth of Rome comes from the work of one man, one of Rome's greatest historians, Livy. He lived in the reign of the Emperor Augustus, over 700 years after the city was founded. Legends told that Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, twins who were cast into the wilderness to die. But the boys were said to be saved by a she-wolf who suckled them. They grew up like savages in the woods. When they returned to found the city of Rome, they were filled with the simple, ferocious spirit of their wolf mother. According to legend, Romulus and Remus then led their people to the bend in the river Tiber where she found them. There Rome was born. The year was 753 BC. But hardly had they founded the city than the two brothers quarreled over who should be king. It was left to the augurs to decide. Augurs were the priests of early Rome who divined the will of the gods. They studied the movements of birds, the weather, the entrails of sheep before making their pronouncements, known as the auguries. The augurs placed each brother on a hilltop, then waited. When birds flocked over Romulus, they knew he would be the first king of Rome. But Remus refused the augury, and the brothers fought. Romulus killed him. The first king of Rome, suckled by a wolf, bathed in his brother's blood, walked away furious and triumphant. It was a fitting augury for the bloodshed and strife that lay ahead.
The story about Romulus killing his twin brother at the moment of the founding of the city is a very old story. It's very, very remarkable that in the late Republic, the Romans were fighting civil wars, and of course, it didn't escape their notice that this seemed to be prefigured in the myth with Romulus killing his brother. They actually thought this was a sort of curse on them, that they were fated to destroy each other.
Well, the whole Roman psyche was based on violence. If you look at the foundation legends of Romulus and Remus, that's based on fratricide, right? One brother kills another to found a city. And from that point, it just escalates.
The violence of the early Romans, in fact and fiction, was born of desperation. In real life, shunned by neighboring tribes, Rome was forced to welcome outcasts, vagrants, and fugitives. The early Romans were primitive people struggling desperately to survive. The grim stories of the first Romans were as surprising to Livy as they are to us. They certainly didn't provide the role models he was looking for. His little book turned into one of the most monumental histories ever written. By the time he died in 17 AD, it had grown to 142 volumes, all written laboriously in wax. It had absorbed his entire life. Livy's Chronicle was the bestseller of its day. It was more successful than he could ever have hoped, but had no effect whatsoever on the moral chaos of empire. Even 142 books were no match for the influence of so much power. By now, Rome was a juggernaut whose momentum was unstoppable. Its course set by its mythic beginnings, whether fact or fiction. As it approached the 5th century BC, Rome was emerging from its legendary past into the real world of recorded history. It was now a thriving province of the Etruscan world, ruled by Etruscan kings. Primitive mud and thatch huts of Rome's early days had given way to a city of brick. Rome was absorbing people from surrounding lands and growing fast. Etruscan and Greek traders met in its busy streets. Phoenician boats from Sicily and North Africa sailed the Tiber. Wine, olives, and gold flooded into Italy. But Rome was still no different from many other prosperous cities of the Mediterranean. What first set it apart was not its capacity for trade or engineering or even warfare, but its ability to organize itself. The man who reshaped Roman society was an Etruscan king called Servius Tullius. There are no statues of him. We have no idea what he looked like. He never became as famous as later rulers of Rome, but his mark on history may be even greater. And yet, all Servius Tullius did was carry out history's first census.
Now, the Roman census, is a very important institution. They would count the Roman citizens, all right, and list them, and then distribute them in their appropriate classes and political units and so on. The census was a kind of way of grading Roman citizens according to their status and prestige.
In the 6th century BC, the census detailed every Roman's obligations to the city, to obey its laws, pay taxes, and do military service. But much more important, it also gave them rights. This was the great innovation of Servius. In proportion to their contribution, Romans were given a say in how their city was run. Servius sowed the seeds of representational government. He organized an assembly to govern the city and gave it a name: the Senate. Finally, the census decreed that each of the city's social classes should contribute a group of soldiers for Rome's defense. They were called the legions, the fighting force that was going to put Rome's destiny back in its own hands and one day give it the world. The census didn't create equality or democracy. Rome remained a society governed by kings and nobles. Women had few rights. But it created a level of organization unheard of in the ancient world. No man did more for Rome than the Etruscan king Servius. His reforms laid the foundations for Rome's greatest achievement, the creation of the Republic. But like so many Roman rulers, he was brought down by treachery and intrigue. The king's own daughter wanted her husband Tarquin on the throne. Her henchmen knew how to get him there. And after they murdered the great king, power and paranoia went hand in hand in Rome. For almost 2 centuries, Rome had been ruled by Etruscan kings and Etruscan nobility. Under Servius, things had gone well. Under Tarquin, his successor, brutality and decadence flourished. While he and his relatives devoted themselves to pleasure, their henchmen carried out campaigns of political murder to remove any and all opposition. Romans were beginning to hate everything the Etruscans stood for. Resentment smoldered. A woman called Lucretia was the spark that would set it on fire. She was well loved and highly regarded for her kindness, beauty, and loyalty. She represented everything Romans felt they had and the Etruscans didn't: honor, virtue, bravery. One day, the king's son and some of his Etruscan nobles were on a journey away from Rome. Drunk, they decided to creep back into the city and spy on the most beautiful women to see what they were up to. They found their own wives, as expected, partying. They found Lucretia hard at work.
Because this was an indication of good, virtuous, matronly behavior. Right. This is how Roman women should behave. They should not be sleeping with 300 members of the Senate, like Augustus's daughter allegedly did. They're not supposed to be poisoning members of their family, as Livia allegedly did. They're supposed to be producing cloth.
The next night, when he knew Lucretia's husband was away, King Tarquin's son crept back to her house alone. With a knife at her throat, he raped her and swore that if she breathed a word of it, he'd kill her. That would be unnecessary. The next day, too proud to live with her dishonor, Lucretia killed herself. Romans went wild. Mobs tore through the streets and attacked Etruscans wherever they found them. A stern nobleman named Brutus organized a furious attack on the Etruscan king and his courtiers. They were overwhelmed and fled for their lives. Romans were finally free of their Etruscan overlords. Lucretia's legacy to Rome was its freedom. Romans vowed they would never again live under a king. So how exactly were they going to live? How would they govern themselves? Their solution was momentous. They declared that the affairs of Rome would belong to the people, that citizens would vote, and that Rome would be a res publica, a public affair, a republic. Government would no longer be the business of kings. Rome would be ruled by laws and elected officials. The first two elected leaders, called consuls, were Brutus and Lucretia's widowed husband.
And so a king was replaced with first 2 praetors, eventually 2 consuls, with 2, both of them in agreement on everything, elected annually, so that no one person ever had very much power for very long at all. This paranoia about kings continues all the way through Roman history.
In ways he never could have imagined, Servius's census had borne fruit. The new republic would be organized according to the voting categories and classes he put in place 40 years earlier. The birth of the republic staked Rome's claim to a place in history. SPQR was the republic's banner. Senatus Populusque Romanos, the Senate and people of Rome. In the early years, Rome was a democratic republic, its military an army of citizens. For centuries, it was the proud duty of every landowning Roman to serve in the name of the eternal city.
The citizen militia was a true state army. It was an army that was rationalized along lines of wealth and age. And as best we can tell from our study of ancient history, this was the first army that was literally built into the state as part of the fabric of the state.
Even though these citizen soldiers were not professional fighting men, they were the best trained forces the world had ever seen.
They seem to have been born with weapons in their hands. Never did they take a break from their training. Their maneuvers are like bloodless battles, and their battles blood-stained maneuvers. Victory comes sure and certain. Josephus.
From the Greeks, Romans took most of their early weapons and armor, like traditional round shields and hoplite thrusting spears. From the Gauls, a long javelin called a pilum, which they could throw 100 feet, along with larger oblong shields and chainmail armor. And from the nearby Etruscans, Rome copied the basic organization of her military, the legions of roughly 5,000 men each. The Romans knew how to find an edge anywhere they could. By 260 BC, Rome controlled more than 52,000 square miles, the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po River, and she would not stop here. Rome's reach across the map was now bumping elbows with another, much older empire, Carthage. This powerful empire controlled much of North Africa, Spain, Sicily, and Sardinia. First settled by traders from what is now Lebanon, the city of Carthage was founded in 814 BC, before Rome was even a collection of mud huts. Called the Great Jewel of the Mediterranean, Carthage was rivaled by no other city on earth, least of all young Rome. Little is known about the Carthaginians, who left behind almost no written record. What is known comes from archaeological finds and stories passed down by the Greeks and Romans. 265 BC. The First Punic War with Carthage seemed horribly one-sided. Carthage was a great sea power, and Romans had never fought a single battle at sea.
And so the Romans, in order to fight a naval war, had to develop a navy. And they got a break early in this war when they found a Carthaginian warship that had accidentally washed up on the shore of the Italian coast after having been abandoned by its crew during a storm. And they closely studied the Carthaginian vessel. They took it apart, found out how it was built, and then built hundreds of exact replicas of this Carthaginian ship. So the Romans now had a fleet.
New to naval warfare, the Romans had to find a way to turn things to their advantage. They soon found the answer. Instead of bombarding from a distance, Roman soldiers boarded the enemy's ships using a specially designed plank called a corvus. In hand-to-hand combat, the Roman legions were just as deadly as on land. It took 23 years of fighting, but the Romans won the First Punic War in 241 BC. Romans seized the rich islands of Sicily and Sardinia and forced the king of Carthage to sign a crushing treaty, giving the empire's entire treasury to Rome. It's said a young boy witnessed his people's humiliation that day. The son of a Carthaginian general looked on bitterly, vowing revenge. The child's name was Hannibal. Two decades after Carthage lost the First Punic War, Hannibal was now a soldier, the leader of his nation's military. He was 25 years old and already a great warrior. Fresh from the conquest of Spain, he reminded his troops of his promise to punish Rome.
Year after year you have fought with me and won. Steel your hearts to march forward, to halt only at the walls of Rome.
But attacking Rome wouldn't be easy. No longer in control of the Mediterranean, Hannibal would have to make the journey by land, crossing the Alps with 40,000 men and 37 elephants. Autumn, 218 BC. Man and beast trudge for months over cruel terrain. Their serpentine parade stretches more than 15 miles. Hannibal's troops are professional soldiers, well-equipped and well-trained, and yet the long journey takes a grim toll. When they finally make it through the mountains, 1/3 of Hannibal's men are dead. Most of the horses and all but one of the elephants have perished, and yet the survivors march on. Even before the first battle, Romans see Hannibal as a potent threat.
They never had to face a fiercer or more warlike foe. Carthage had long been an enemy of Rome, and they were bringing with them countless Spaniards, already battle-hungry, and would soon be raising Gauls with their insatiable appetite for blood. War was coming, and it would be fought in Italy in defense of the walls of Rome. Livy.
The Roman Senate raised 6 new legions, more than 30,000 men. The Second Punic War was begun. This time the deciding factor wouldn't be manpower, but strategy. Most Roman commanders were political appointees with little battlefield experience, no match for a military genius like Hannibal.
Hannibal had a spark. I mean, he had many things that made him a great leader. I mean, he knew how to motivate troops, he knew how to innovate on the battlefield, he knew how to make the optimum use of the tools at his command. But in addition to that, he had that spark. He had the ability to read an enemy and find that one maneuver that would cause the enemy to collapse.
In battle after battle, Hannibal humiliated the Roman legions. The most devastating defeat was the Battle of Cannae. 50,000 Romans, more than half the entire Roman military, killed in the worst defeat Rome ever suffered. At last, Rome saw Hannibal for what he was, the first true threat to her survival. For 15 long years, the war against Hannibal dragged on, and large areas of southern Italy defected to him. Hannibal never lost a single battle, and many wondered how long it would be before he attacked the city of Rome.
It was widely expected, of course, that he would take the city, but Rome was heavily fortified. Hannibal seems to have not had proper siege equipment. No matter how many armies of the Romans and their allies Hannibal could defeat, the Romans were always able to raise new armies, to put new armies into the field, and ultimately Hannibal failed to take the city.
And yet the tide didn't turn against Hannibal until the Senate called up a military leader in the same league with the legendary Carthaginian. Publius Cornelius Scipio had the cunning and the charisma to match the so-called scourge of Rome. The son of a general and a survivor of the Battle of Cannae, the young Scipio studied Hannibal's tactics closely. Then in 204 BC, rather than confront Hannibal in Italy, Scipio had a brilliant but risky plan, an end run. He sailed to Africa and invaded the empire of Carthage. Carthage was forced to respond, recalling Hannibal from his 17-year torment of Italy. It was the moment of truth. Scipio and Hannibal would fight a single battle to decide the Second Punic War, the Battle of Zama. The two armies gathered forces in the countryside of what is now central Tunisia. Outside the ancient city of Zama, Scipio confronted his arch-rival, Hannibal. It's believed the two men met face to face just before the ultimate battle in an attempt to make peace. Scipio refused Hannibal's terms, saying to his rival, "Prepare for war, since evidently you have found peace intolerable." The two sides were well matched, with about 34,000 men each, but there were crucial differences. Hannibal had been resupplied with 80 of his dreaded elephants, but Scipio had drilled his troops in new tactics for dealing with the great beasts. The Roman troops would form long corridors to funnel the charging elephants away from the front lines where they do the most damage. Scipio also had the support of thousands of local Numidian cavalry who defected from Hannibal. Renowned as the best cavalry in the world, the horsemen added to Scipio's edge. Scipio finally and soundly defeated Hannibal at Zama. Carthage was crippled. Carthage was forced to hand over all but 10 of her warships, all her elephants, and a treasure so great it would take 20 years to pay. The once great empire was impoverished and stripped of all power. Hannibal escaped from the Battle of Zama. For a time, he tried to revive his waning Carthage, but eventually fled into exile in Greece. And though the aging warrior no longer posed any threat, Rome still pursued him, determined to capture the famous scourge. Ultimately, Hannibal denied her the pleasure.
Let us free the Roman people of their long-standing anxiety, seeing that they find it tedious to wait for an old man's death. It is no magnificent victory to defeat a man unarmed and betrayed.
With that, Hannibal put a drink of poison to his lips and drained his cup. But even Hannibal's suicide was not victory enough. After so many years of war, Rome still saw Carthage as an enemy and could not abide her survival in any form. In 146 BC, Rome destroyed the African Empire once and for all in the final Punic War, slaughtering 500,000 people. The pearl of the Mediterranean is ground into dust. Carthage is no more. Rome now controlled the entire Mediterranean, along with parts of Spain, southern Gaul, and the Italian peninsula. At the same time, Rome's power was spreading eastward. In all, Roman armies held more than 250,000 square miles. In 3 centuries, a small backwater city had become a dominant world power. In the past 50 years alone, she more than tripled her domain. Her military was the most successful fighting force the world had ever known. No power on earth could truly threaten her, and every nation in her reach had reason to fear. A small group of wealthy families ruled Rome. Notoriously conservative, they protected their own interests and quietly resisted reform, until one of their own broke the code of silence. Tiberius Gracchus was born to privilege. Grandson of Scipio Africanus, conqueror of Hannibal, and son of Cornelia, an intelligent, ambitious woman who poured her ideals into her 2 sons, Tiberius and Gaius. She told him she was tired of being called the daughter of her father, Scipio. She wanted to be known as the mother of her sons. In 143 BC, the young Tiberius left Rome to join the army in Spain. It was a very disturbing journey.
While Tiberius was traveling through Italy, he saw for himself how the country had been deserted by its native inhabitants, and how those who tilled the soil or tended the flocks were barbarian slaves introduced from abroad. But it was above all the people themselves who did most to arouse Tiberius's energy and ambitions, calling upon him to recover the public land for the poor. Plutarch.
The ambitious aristocrat had found his cause. In the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, the Roman Empire had more than doubled in size. The conquering soldiers were still volunteers, poor Roman citizens who owned small farms. When the Roman Empire was small, this citizens' militia had worked well. Men served for only part of each year, coming home regularly to work their farms. But getting home to harvest became impossible as the empire grew and armies were conquering faraway lands in Africa or Asia or Northern Europe.
If you're serving abroad for years and years, in a long process of imperial conquest. The result is that when you put down your sword at the end of the campaign, there is no plowshare left, because your brother nicked it ages ago, and it wasn't just your brother, it's the big landlord next door who's extended his estate. So that you do have very large numbers of people who don't have land to return to.
Their new estates netted the Roman aristocracy obscene profits, which they used to buy foreign slaves to work the land. So when veterans returned from war, they'd lost their land to the wealthy and their jobs to slaves. Tiberius Gracchus promised to change all that.
The wild beasts that roam over Italy have their dens and holes to lurk in. But the men who fight and die for our country enjoy the common air and light and nothing else. It is their lot to wander with their children, houseless and homeless over the face of the earth. The truth is that our soldiers fight and die to protect the wealth and luxury of others. They are called the masters of the world, but they don't possess a single clod of earth which is truly their own. Gracchus.
Gracchus proposed something radical. The government should divide public land among Rome's homeless. The senators were horrified. His plan threatened their own huge estates and also their political livelihood. If passed, it would make Tiberius Gracchus the patron of Rome's massive underclass. He'd be the most powerful man in Rome.
The story of Tiberius Gracchus is the Roman aristocrat who cheats. He does the thing that they've all got a little convention among themselves. There's some things you do, there's some things you don't do. And you don't bust the system by going straight to the people and offering them things. You can see it as breaking a system of patronage.
The Roman elite panicked. A group of senators confronted Gracchus as he was speaking to his supporters. In a fit of rage, they beat him to death with the chairs they were sitting on. Rome's boldest reformer was then dumped into the river Tiber. Yet Gracchus had revolutionized Roman politics. By championing the needs of the poor, Gracchus had shown how an ambitious aristocrat could outmaneuver his conservative peers. But people power would do more than divide Rome's leaders. Ultimately, it would threaten the Republic. More than a century after the wars against Carthage began, Rome was left drained, both financially and emotionally. War-weary Romans had lost hundreds of thousands of sons to bloody battles in faraway lands. Surviving soldiers had been fighting so long, they barely remembered their homes. One thing became clear: a non-professional citizen army was no longer adequate for an empire the size of Rome's. It would fall largely to one man to professionalize the Roman military, a general and politician named Gaius Marius. Marius saw the need for far-reaching changes in the structure of the Roman army. To be a soldier would now be a career in itself, not merely a sideline for landed citizens. Marius recruited even the poorest Romans into the legions and issued them standardized equipment, making them the best outfitted soldiers in the ancient world. Including weapons, a soldier carried at least 80 pounds on his back, earning troops of this era the nickname Marius's Mules. Rome's first true professional soldiers were even more fit and better disciplined than earlier armies. But the biggest change of all, this new class of warrior had a special relationship with its commander. When they became veterans, Marius would personally see to it that his men received a grant of land, often in recently conquered territories. In the end, this was more than a generous perk for poor soldiers with no farms to return to. In fact, it was revolutionary. Suddenly, a soldier's first loyalty was to the general who recruited him and took care of him in old age, and not to the state.
For the first time, the soldier looked to the general, not only for allegiance, but for pay, for retirement benefits, if you will. And then over time, then the army began to dominate the state rather than the state dominating the army. And that's the terrible legacy of Marius.
Powerful generals now controlled their own private armies. Soon, they would use them however they saw fit, even against Rome herself. By the 1st century BC, a powerful general called Lucius Cornelius Sulla would be the first to cash in on the loyalty of his men. And Sulla was famous for commanding the affections of soldiers.
It was Sulla more than anyone else who set the example. In order to corrupt and win over the soldiers of other generals, he gave his own troops a good time and spent money lavishly on them. He was thus, at the same time, encouraging the evils of both treachery and of debauchery. Plutarch.
In 89 BC, when the Senate ordered Sulla to hand over control of his army in southern Italy, he refused, and his troops remained fiercely devoted to him. Armed with 6 renegade legions, more than 30,000 men, Sulla then did an astonishing thing. He marched on the city of Rome. Once in control of the city, Sulla's soldiers went on a bloody rampage.
Hundreds of Sulla's political enemies were then rounded up and executed, and he was the first among several generals who was to use his military forces in this way.
Sulla planted his own supporters in power and quickly left the city in peace, but nothing in Rome would ever be the same. A Roman general used his troops to enforce his own political power. It was the first time, but it would by no means be the last. Soon, another Roman army would march against Rome, led by a great leader, politician, and general. A man named Julius Caesar.
He was a slightly built man with soft and white skin who suffered from headaches and was subject to epileptic fits. He was particular in his personal appearance and dress, was clean-shaven, and was sensitive of his premature balding. Plutarch.
Shrewd and intense, the future dictator clearly saw his path to power. Only by victory on the battlefield could a politician hope to be taken seriously as a leader in Rome. Now 40 years old, Caesar needed a war to win, and the obvious choice was to make one of his very own in a place called Gaul. The Senate named Caesar governor of 3 provinces, Illyricum, Cisalpine, and Transalpine Gaul, the only parts of Gaul Rome controlled. Caesar hungered for the rest. The Gauls had long been the most powerful and successful people of northern and central Europe. By Caesar's time, they dominated the lands of modern France, England, and Ireland. The Romans considered them barbarians, but Gallic culture was actually quite advanced. And yet, what the Gauls were most famous for was their bloodlust in battle. They excelled in psychological warfare. They wore body paint and caked their hair with lime and mud, terrifying the methodical Romans. 5 million Gauls stood between Caesar and the glory he craved. If he could add the lands of modern France to Roman territory, he would hugely increase his reputation and his power. In 58 BC, on the excuse of stopping a Gallic tribe from entering Roman territory, Caesar moved his legions into Gaul. And for the next decade, the bold general does precisely what he set out to do: conquer. Tribe after tribe, battle after battle, Caesar prevailed against the Gauls again and again. Caesar would now summon the ghost of Sulla, Rome's first warlord. Like Sulla, Caesar was returning from war with an army loyal to him, not Rome. Like Sulla, Caesar wanted something the Republic could never allow. In January 49 BC, Caesar committed the ultimate act of treachery. It was never a raging torrent or a great river, but it was destined for a place in history. Its very name has come to mean a boundary and an irrevocable decision: the Rubicon. For Caesar, at first it was simply the southern boundary of his province in Gaul. It would soon become a great deal more. The Senate recalled Caesar to Rome, but ordered him to leave his legions behind. He was between a rock and a hard place. He had to go to Rome, but if he went unprotected, he'd almost certainly be murdered by Pompey's supporters. He believed he had no other choice but to call on the loyalty of his men.
He turns to his troops and says, "I'm being insulted by the state. Do you think this is a good thing? Protect me, defend my position in society." That's what the troops were marching for. At least that's how Julius Caesar put it.
It was a high-stakes game of chess using real armies. In 49 BC, in bold defiance of the Senate, Caesar took his army out of Gaul across an unassuming little stream.
We can still turn back, but once we cross that little bridge, we will have to fight it out. The die is cast. Julius Caesar.
The moment his army crossed the Rubicon, his intent became obvious to all. Caesar was marching on Rome and into civil war.
No one knows what to do. If we resist, there will probably be bloodshed. Cicero.
The Senate quickly chose Pompey, conqueror of the East, to defend the Republic. But Caesar wanted absolute power, even at the price of civil war. Rome's two greatest generals met in Greece.
Brother against brother, eagle against eagle, flag against flag. Citizens, what is this madness? Lucan.
Pompey was no match for Caesar and his brutal fighting force. He fled to Egypt, but was eventually captured by Caesar's spies. The fate of the Republic hung in the balance. But Caesar had other things on his mind. In Egypt, in 48 BC, he met the young Queen of the Nile, Cleopatra. They fell in love and had a child. Cleopatra persuaded Caesar to help her overthrow her brother and gain the throne of Egypt. Then, in 46 BC, she accompanied Caesar back to Rome.
Cleopatra represented for the Romans every threat you can imagine. She was African, a woman, beautiful, she was powerful. You find her seducing Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, right, who conquered the Gauls, who was this great soldier, who was this politician, who wanted to be the dictator in Rome. Cleopatra reminded them of their vulnerability, and that frightened them very, very much.
Vulnerability was not something Caesar understood. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered, was the motto of his dazzling return to the city. That evening, he threw a banquet for 22,000 of Rome's poorest citizens. Hypnotized, the people did the unthinkable. They voluntarily voted Caesar the absolute powers of a dictator. Caesar then shocked everyone. He used his total control not for revenge, but social reform. Like Gracchus, Caesar gave the Roman poor what they wanted. He made sure no Roman citizen ever went hungry. He gave grain to the poor and land to his soldiers, paid for by himself. Caesar, the benign dictator, was incredibly popular. Like Gracchus, he was a little too popular for some.
Here was a man who was desperate to be king of the Roman people, master of the whole world. A man who believes such an ambition to be morally right must be insane. Cicero.
In February 44 BC, he went too far. Caesar asked the people to elect him dictator for life. To accept absolute power forever was an open insult to his Republican peers. Cicero was disgusted and retired from political life in protest. The Senate wasn't so meek. They invited Caesar to explain his actions. It was the Ides of March. By mid-morning, the crisis was over. At the foot of a statue of Pompey lay Caesar's body, stabbed 35 times. Rome's poor were outraged. At Caesar's funeral, they lit torches from the pyre and set fire to the houses of the assassins. That night, a comet blazed across the sky. It seemed an omen. Julius Caesar, the champion of the poor. The citizens of Rome declared him a god. That changed everything. For the poor had made it clear they valued the gifts of a dictator more than the empty promises of a republic.
You could get rid of Caesar, but you couldn't get rid of Caesarism. As Cicero says at one point, it's a strange thing, we've killed the man and confirmed everything that he's done, because you couldn't do away with it. And in fact, those last years after Caesar's murder are not about the destruction of the Republic. The Republic was destroyed by Caesar. It's simply about who's going to replace Caesar.
Two rivals came forward to vie for the dead dictator's absolute power. Octavian, Caesar's 18-year-old son-in-law and heir, and Mark Antony, Caesar's closest friend and ally, no stranger to the politics of intimidation. In 43 BC, Antony raised an army and surrounded the Senate. The Republic was once again under siege. Cicero came out of retirement to attack Antony. He thought Octavian was the Republic's last chance. Cicero confronted Antony in the Senate.
Your ambition to reign is as fierce as Caesar's. I would gladly offer my own body if my death could redeem the freedom of our nation.
Antony took Cicero at his word, and 2 months later, his thugs murdered the Republic's boldest defender. His hands were cut off and put on public display in Rome. Its conscience dead, the Roman Republic was in crisis. In 33 BC, 10 years after the assassination of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony and Octavian were still fighting for control of the Roman world. The ghost of civil war was back. The Roman people were desperate for a change.
The rule of a single man is the only remedy for a country in turmoil. Tacitus.
Octavian finally defeated Antony in 31 BC to become the undisputed ruler of the entire Roman world. But his greatest victory would be one of statesmanship. Octavian was poised to redefine the very meaning of power in Rome. He understood patronage was the secret to control in Roman society. With Rome's vast treasury at his disposal, he set about making every Roman his client, obligated to him, the universal patron. Octavian handed out huge cash bonuses to Rome's army. He now had the undivided loyalty of over 400,000 soldiers. He then played to the people like never before, increasing the grain handout and building huge aqueducts to bring fresh water to Rome's poor. Octavian then focused on the most important ritual of all. He staged the most lavish games Rome had ever seen. Wild beasts and gladiators fought for days in the packed arena. Seduced, the people voted him all the power he asked for. The Roman Senate then stunned everyone. In 27 BC, they allowed Octavian what they had denied Caesar, the constitutional right to absolute power for life. Octavian took the name Augustus, the sacred one. Rome, once a bastion of open government, had willingly become an empire, ruled by a single man. Octavian Augustus had become the Roman Empire's first emperor. For them, Augustus was a savior. He offered the peace and stability they had craved for nearly a century. From the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from Spain to Syria, people were free to think about something other than war. It was the Pax Romana, Rome's golden age, the longest period of peace Europe has ever known.